Today we are joined by Allison Kranich. Allison is a licensed clinical professional counselor practicing at Northwestern Medicine. Her work centers around the impact of technology and social media on child-adolescent development, the overall increase in mental health issues in youth since the arrival of smartphones, and ways parents can intervene. Allison, we're so happy to have you today. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Yes. So I just want to kind of get the conversation started on how you got into the mental health field, what sort of drove your passion to help others, and specifically children, adolescents. What drove that passion and how did it come to be?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that. I've always liked the study of psychology and looking at patterns in behavior and how there's a science behind it, and that the science and the numbers have always intrigued me. I'm actually the first in a long line of family members to not go into engineering, but that
Really?
math trend still seems to be there. Like, just again, looking at statistics, looking at numbers, looking at all these different studies of how people develop, how they change, how they're impacted by the world, and that really just started to interest me. I never wanted to work with children and adolescents. And I was at an internship one day and they threw a kid at me, and then I liked working with kids. And
It's funny how you find out those things about yourself. I was the opposite, where I started to work with kids. I was like, oh, I love, pediatrics. And I started volunteering at the local hospitals, and I found out pretty quickly, I actually want to work with adults and like those that are like aware of symptoms and can describe them to you. So it's just funny how you kind of get to know yourself.
right. And not many people want to work with kids. It's usually what you explained.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm the oddball with the opposite.
No, you're fighting the good fight for sure. I mean, those years are so formative, especially I would imagine you are the expert, but in crafting one sort of like mental health and how they carry themselves and take care of that, nurture that throughout the rest of their lives.
And they're fun.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they're resilient, and it's really neat to watch them and see them grow. And I also really like working with the parents too. I've taken a big interest over several years in doing parenting work,
Yeah.
and helping families just work better together.
Great. Yeah. So tell me, the most patients you see, I know you were saying that they start at age of 4.
Mhm.
What is the age group and like demographic of the most of your patients? Does it range pretty like to 18, or how does that work?
Yeah, I would say it's a pretty good range right now. I do start at age 4. I go all the way up, so I don't really have an end cap. Um, I see a lot of teens, a lot of preteens, a lot of teens, and a lot of young adults. I would say that's a big chunk of it. I see a good number of younger elementary school children, but a lot of teens, a lot of preteens, a lot of young
Okay.
adults.
And the passion for the social media and technology impact, how did that come to be?
I started to notice over this was even pre-COVID, but it really came to light during the pandemic.
Mhm.
I noticed this with all of everyone's complaining about being lonely. Everyone is sad. Everyone is anxious. No one's sleeping. I'm like, what's the connection here? See, it has to be social media. It has to be phones. And then I read a really good book. The author calls it iGen. And so she talks about Gen Z and this generation that has always grown up with technology and phones, and study after study after study shows that it's the phones that are causing it. And so knowing that link, I really wanted to figure out, one, how did all this happen? How did we get here? And now what do we do about it? And so that, in terms of meeting with patients, that's really my passion. How do we fix this?
Yes. And it's so interesting that something that only came to be, 10, 15 years ago, the invention of the smartphone, because when I was a kid, even like I'm in my 20s, but when I was a young child, the phones out there were like the flip phones, the razors, where you couldn't connect to wireless internet or like
Mhm.
download Instagram or TikTok on your cell phone. Those things weren't even in
Right.
existence. Like Facebook, I don't even think came out until like I was either like in my teens or like shortly before that.
Right. And so Facebook came out in 2006, I believe. The
Okay.
iPhone came out in 2007.
Okay.
iPad came out in 2010.
Okay.
And I forget what year it was. Maybe 2012 is
Mhm.
when, no, that was when Facebook took over Instagram. At some point in that time, the
Mhm.
iPhone came out with the front facing camera, which was a
Mm.
really big deal. And that changed a lot of the culture around social media.
Mhm.
But things really, every study you look at, they really took a turn in 2012. And that was when we crossed that, as in the US, we crossed that 50% mark where people, more than 50% of people own smartphones.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was where every curve down,
Everything
it goes downhill.
changed.
Yes.
Yeah.
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 There doesn't seem to be any exception.
Yeah, that's so interesting too. It's like nowadays you see not only parents, but like the government, like everyone's trying to sort of like put limitations on that because they're seeing what's happening. And like when I was a kid, you had like things like parental controls on like the games and like the devices you were using. Like, if you had a cell phone, your parents could set a cap on it where it's like, 9 o'clock, you can't send out a text or like call anyone
Mm-hmm.
besides like your familiar like line
Mm-hmm.
network anymore. And it's just interesting now that there's conversations going on about banning TikTok and things like that. So I think people are starting to see like the negative impacts of it, and people are trying to figure out like what's the right balance. Like, of course, we want people to be able to express themselves and to like content creators, like that's their source of income. But it's hard to strike that balance of like what's good for society versus what's bad for it.
Yeah, and I kind of think we're going about it in a backwards way. Like you said, we're trying to put all these different restrictions on it. We're trying to limit it. We're trying to, and I see parents really struggle at this. It's an uphill battle that very few, if any, have really conquered. I've given my kid this device. I'm
Yeah.
gonna try and lock it down. I'm gonna limit it. But it never works. And I just keep going back to, if we just took it away, that would solve the problem. And I really think a lot about alcohol.
Mhm.
We don't give 12-year-olds alcohol and
Right.
say, we're going to put limits on it. We're going to restrict you. We don't do that because it's dangerous. We don't start teaching 12-year-olds about sex and saying, well, let's do it safely. And all these, we just don't do that. But somehow we've taken this phone and we've said, here you go. Let's see what
Free
happens.
reign.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
so
let's see what happens.
I do think we're going about it in a backwards way. And I think it's really going to be a battle to get families to say, we're just not doing this.
Yeah. For the patients that you see in your practice, have you found that parents have started to pick up on the harmful effects of it? Have they started implementing controls?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I hear this from people inside and out of work. They know it's bad, but they don't take it away.
Hmm.
And I haven't really totally figured that out yet. The best, conclusion I've come to is that we live way too busy of lives. Everything
Mm,
is overscheduled. We feel pulled in all these different directions. And,
yeah.
especially as a parent, sometimes having your kid watch something gives you a moment of peace. Right. And so that's the best conclusion I've come to, is why there's this resistance to take the devices away.
Yes.
Um, but again, I think we're going about it backwards. If we would just slow down and
Yeah.
we would just, allow ourselves a minute, we wouldn't need all these other things.
Right.
We're working harder, not smarter.
The allow ourselves a minute is such a good point because it's, I don't know, maybe there's a difference. You can probably speak a bit more to this, but I'm wondering if you see a difference between patients that you see that are like more in the young adult age group that didn't like they weren't born into the smartphone age. Like they kind of were born into the period before the smartphone age. So they
Mm-hmm.
weren't like immediately handed an iPhone out of the womb versus like, probably those in my brother's age, like 10, like, 7 to 10 years younger, that they were sort of born in that and that's all that they know. So they didn't even learn the human interaction and like socialization piece. I see teens like all the time now, not even talking to a single person around them. The eyes are just in the phone. Like it's hard to watch. Yeah.
Well, and I've heard people say too, you walk down the hall in a high school or a middle school. And I
Yeah.
remember I grew up in I was born in 85, so I grew up in like the we never I didn't have a smartphone until after college, grad school.
Okay.
But the halls were loud, right? In a
Yes.
good way. People were interacting, people were talking, and now they're
Yeah.
just quiet. Everybody's
Yeah.
looking down. Or even, like the time before class, right? Like you got into class, you're waiting for the teacher, everybody's talking and having a good time.
Exactly.
That doesn't happen.
No, which I actually heard the same thing, and it made me so sad to hear
Yes.
that, because I like the moments that I like are my core memories from like middle school, high school, like it was just the time in between classes where I was just hanging out with my friends and talking
Right.
with my friends and having lunch with my friends. And like I heard that lunchtime for kids nowadays, they're just literally on their phone, not even talking to
Yes.
one another.
Mhm.
I can't even imagine it. Like,
And it's funny you mentioned that about lunch too, because someone was
mhm.
telling me that in their kids' school, they allow devices at lunchtime.
Really?
And I cannot think, this is what we were talking about, like, I cannot think of a worse thing for a child or preteen's development than doing that.
Yes.
That is the time where they should be socializing face to face.
Mm-hmm.
And they're resistant to taking it away.
Yes. Do you see, I don't know, maybe like there haven't been studies on this. I'm sure there haven't, because I'm sure researchers out there, they're thinking way ahead of me. But have there been any studies done on like, the newer generations and like increases in social anxiety? Because if they're not learning like the socialization piece, like the talking to other people, how to communicate, I'm sure they're developing like, certain levels of fear or nervousness when they get in a social setting where they don't have the opportunity to like stick their head into a phone.
Absolutely. I couldn't think of like a specific study, but I know they're out there. I see more social anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
What we actually see is that this period of adolescence is being prolonged, and they're not learning to do things independently. So they're not learning to drive a car. People are getting their licenses later and later. They're not learning to do things like job interviews. And so they're not learning all these social skills. But then after high school's over, life isn't taking place anymore on screens. They have to go interview for a job. They have to go to the
Right.
grocery store. They have to, and so you think of two of the things. I'm just thinking when we were kids, like if you wanted a pizza, you had to call the pizza place. Or if you wanted to go to a friend's house, you had to ring the doorbell.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't happen anymore. It's that they'll be in the driveway and say, I'm here, come on out. Right? Or you order food and you just go on your phone, order it, and it arrives. You don't have contact with anyone, and they don't have the tools to do it, and it's showing, and I think it's going to get a lot worse.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Like I have distinct memories, even like to this, like, this week I went to like, let's say Target, for example, and I just watched people. There are like the self-checkout counters where you just scan bag yourself, right? And then, you have the area where the people working at the Target or the whatever store it is, they're standing at the register waiting to ring people out. They don't have a customer in front of them. I'm literally watching people just go up to the line and get in the self-checkout register when both of the register, like people manning it, were open, completely free. It would probably be faster.
It's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's when I'm going back to your original question. One of the things that I really like about my job is I get to talk to people all day. I get to talk to different kinds of people. I get to learn about. If I had to stare at a screen all day, I would go crazy.
Yeah. Going back to like my accounting to medicine switch, that is the main reason. I've learned about myself so much that I just love interacting with other people. I am definitely like the Webster's Dictionary's definition of like the extrovert, like getting energy from talking to others. Like when I get home from talking to others, I'm just like, I can't stop talking. I'm like so energy. So like my family, like my work, they're like, Massa, please stop. Like, that's enough. You know? So I think like that human interaction is like really starting to lose its value among the younger generations, which is really sad.
And it is, and I do think it's going to backfire, because for 99.99 whatever percent of human existence, we have interacted face to face. And
Yeah.
so, it's the challenges are growing at an exponential level. And unless we do something about it,
Yeah.
we're going to really struggle, especially as this younger generation grows up and enters the workforce.
Yeah. Agreed.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm curious too, have you, when it comes to like comparing like your patients for younger generations versus older, do you see a lot of differences in sort of the issues or, you know, like things that they're coming to you to counsel them on? Or because of, you know, the growing use of social media, do you find that they're like pretty similar across the board?
Well, everyone has anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
Like, everyone is struggling with anxiety because it's just a crazy world. And I think I see similar things.
Mm-hmm.
But I will say it tends to be more with women
Okay.
and girls.
Yeah.
Which we know from the data that social media impacts women and girls much differently than men and boys.
Yeah.
But like I've met with grown women talking about how, you know, their friend posted this on Facebook and that made them really upset. So it doesn't seem to have it doesn't seem to pick a generation per se. It seems to impact everyone. I think the thing that draws them apart is that for the older generation, I hear more often them say, okay, and then I went and talked to that friend.
Mm.
I don't see that as much with the younger generation. Now, that's a generality. I've seen it reversed, but it's minimally. And so with the younger generation, it's more so, you know, we had a disagreement and then I blocked them.
Wow.
Yeah. And then it was over. And that's another thing that we're seeing too, is this kind of like relationships are changing because they're not as invested in them. You know, like you meet someone online and there's a conflict and you block them and you never talk to them again. And that's that.
Out of sight, out of mind.
No conflict resolution skills, no, you know, sitting with those emotions and working through them. Whereas when you're in person with someone, when you see someone at the office, when you have a friend, you have to confront them. You have to work through it.
Yeah.
And so not only are we losing that face-to-face human interaction, but we're losing the ability to work through conflict.
Yes.
And that has so many implications that it kind of scares me to think about.
It does. And as you say that, I'm thinking I was actually listening to, it was recently like Dr. Phil did a podcast episode with one of the podcasts that I listen to on a regular basis. And it spoke so loud when I hear him say, you know, young people are not living their lives, but they're watching people live their lives on their phone. And that's
Right.
like the comparison piece becomes so strong because, especially for women, because in, you know, old days before we had social media and you had people posting all this content, the comparison was to like models in a magazine, right? And now you have influencers every day just spitting out like 10 videos a day, and you're thinking like, wow, this girl has such a glamorous life. She has so glamorous clothes. She's so beautiful. But you don't know like what's happening behind the scenes. She's recording a video in full glam in an outfit, saying, I'm, you know, getting ready to go out to this big event or this gala or this whatever else. And she's ending the recording and taking off her clothes and sitting on the couch. But you don't see that piece because it's such a highlight reel, right?
Well, and also I think because there's been a lot more people on social media showing the behind the scenes. But I don't know any studies on this, but I have to wonder, does that really make a difference? Because if you're flipping between their highlight reel or their edited photo and their background photo, you're always going to find the edited one more attractive or more desirable, and you're going to gravitate towards that. So I'm not even sure if that helps.
No, it doesn't. You're right. And it's that type of like daily life content, the day in my life, the get ready with me, it's like the behind the scenes type of content that, like, however organic and natural you think it is, it's still curated, right? Like, they're still creating that content and putting it out into the world.
Well, and I think the biggest thing, especially related to this, but with social media and phones in general, is when you're watching these things on a phone,
Mm-hmm.
you are not in tune with your environment around you. And that is huge. And it has so many implications for mental health. And I just think that's a big deal. If you are listening to someone give their, expert parenting hacks, you're not playing with your child.
Right.
And it makes me think of one of the podcasts I listened to talks about it. I can't take credit for it, but they were talking about Baby Einstein. And when Baby Einstein came out so many
Yes.
years ago, it was a big deal. And it actually really failed our children. And so, they use the example of Baby Einstein was talking about an apple on the screen. And again, I can't think of who it was to credit them, but the person who was talking said, why not just give your kid an apple and have them feel it and look at it and talk about it together. And so it makes me think of that when you're talking about all these different content creators, like, why don't we just spend time with our friends and do those things?
Why don't you just live your own life? Yeah.
Well, and when you talk about, they're not going to parties or doing these things as much anymore. We're really seeing that with this younger generation, this Gen Z. So Gen Z is anyone born between 1995 and 2012. And we're seeing it a lot. They don't go to parties as much. So the alcohol use, the car accidents, all those things have gone down.
Okay.
Which is great.
Yeah.
But all these other things have gone up: anxiety, depression, loneliness, suicide risk factors, all that kind of stuff, because the party's online. They're just doing it online. And what is fascinating to me is in 2011, I think this is a big deal and not talked about enough. For the first time ever for teens, the suicide rate was higher than the homicide rate.
Wow.
Ever.
Wow.
Yeah, which I think is just crazy to think about. Because if you're going to harm someone, you have to be physically with them.
Right.
People just aren't. Not that we want the homicide rate to go up, of course, but that just goes to show that people are lonely. People are spending more time alone.
Yeah, they're spending time so much by themselves, and I love that you bring that up, because I've been reading so much. And we've been alluding to it a little bit, but I've been reading so much about this major, like, mental health crisis that we're dealing with, and how just, like, rates of anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation are just skyrocketing amongst, like, that, Gen Z to, like, young millennials age group. And it's just, like, the comparison factor there and the competition that they feel like they have between someone they haven't even met in real life is pushing them to those thoughts, which is so sad, because you don't know that person's life. You've never even met them. You have no idea what that person's going through. It's so sad to see that people are just, like, getting themselves to the point, and it's not people getting themselves to, right? It's like the technology, the social, like, all the innovation, while great, it's leading people to feel like that's the path, which is so
right. Yeah, it's really become out of control. Again, there's a time and place for social media and smartphones, but even if you look at, like, the people who created these things, they were created to do exactly this. Right? And to make money. And there's this quote, like, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. We are the product of Instagram, of Facebook, right? Like, we are their product. But like Steve Jobs famously said, he would never give his kid an iPad ever.
Wow.
Because it wasn't good for them.
Right.
So they know this. And we just got sucked into it.
Yeah, definitely. Do you find that, with all the social media usage, for those patients that are kind of struggling with those issues, how do you help them, like, manage that stress, those triggers of anxiety? What do you recommend? Do you do you have them, spend time off their phones or like sort of prescribe time off from their phones each week? Like what does that look like for you and your patients and your
I mean, I tried to, but I don't know if I've ever been able to be successful with it. I try to say, don't look at your phone, but
Yeah.
the problem I've really realized is that we need them. Like my daughter started kindergarten last year, and I had to download Twitter because that's how the school, like that's how her teacher updated the pictures. And nothing against her teacher. Her teacher didn't do anything wrong, but I had to get this new social media app to figure out what my daughter was doing in school. And so it's really hard sometimes to get people to just put the phones down. And so
Yeah.
I do a few things with people. I think one of the things we start with is, how do you recognize what you're feeling and when you're feeling it, right? Like don't figure out if you're anxious by watching a video of someone tell you about anxiety. Put it down. Think about how you feel in your body. Think about what's going on in your mind and identify that feeling for yourself.
Right.
So I have them do that first and foremost, because so many people think that they're feeling a certain way because they've read it or they've seen a video on it, but they're not actually in tune with themselves, which is very interesting to me.
Yeah.
So that's a first step in therapy. And then the next step is being more mindful, being more in the present. And that's a challenging task, but something we work on, I would say, for many sessions.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what sort of practices like do you advise them to do to kind of like, if that stress is overcoming, them and making them feel so anxious, they feel like they can't operate in their normal lives? What are those practices that you guide them to like, bring them back to the present and like bring them back into their own bodies, so to speak?
Yeah, so I start by teaching them a little bit about mindfulness. So I've noticed this trend where people think mindfulness is clearing your mind,
Mm-hmm.
which is not the case. I mean, if we had a magic wand to clear our mind, we would just do that. But mindfulness is really the act of bringing your focus to the present moment.
Okay.
And as your mind wanders, which it naturally will, you pull it back to the present. And it's
Mm-hmm.
that constant pulling back that is really the act of mindfulness. And I tell people that a great way to practice is to focus on your five senses. What are your five senses experiencing? And this is something that you can't do on social media, right? That doesn't engage your senses. And so someone I worked with many years ago started this. We all keep jars of Jolly Ranchers in our office. When we have people practice mindfulness, we give them a Jolly Rancher. And we tell them, what does the wrapper feel like? Do you hear the wrapper? And then they put it in their mouth. Describe what it tastes like. Describe what it feels like. What kind of taste do you have in your mouth? All of that is mindfulness, and they're in the
Yes.
present. And then I'll kind of point out to them after the exercise, like, oh, were you thinking about, whatever was bothering them while we were doing that exercise? They'll say, no, not really. I'll say, okay, well, there you go, right?
Yeah.
Like you were able to move your mind over to the present. And so I really work with people to try and individualize how they can work that into their lives. And so I had one person who she kept lotion in her purse and she would use that on her hands to really engage her senses. And so again, someone else had chapstick. There's lots of different ways to engage her senses. And so I really help people to find what's right for them, what fits into their lives.
Yeah. It's funny that you say that too, because I found that the one thing that really helps me manage my stress, I remember I started doing it actually when I was like in my old job. Once like the busy season died down and it was the summer and like, you could leave the office at like 5 or 6 to get away and like kind of tend to your personal life. I found that activities such as like group workouts or group classes where you're kind of taken out of your own mind and you're thinking about nothing but the actual movement that you're doing. Or I started taking like these cookie decorating classes where there was so much like attention to detail required that you're not thinking about anything but like, drawing the icing on these cookies and making them like
That's
making the
mindfulness.
designs, right? And so it's so interesting that like kind of bringing yourself out of your own head, it brings like grounds you back to yourself.
Right. Well, and here's the really interesting thing about mindfulness is,
Mm-hmm.
and they've done several different brain studies on this. I think they did fMRIs and things like that. But
Okay.
when people engage in these activities for even 10 minutes,
Mm-hmm.
it really turns down or deactivates the anxious part of your brain.
Yeah.
And so we're taking something like social media, like smartphones that are making us more anxious, right? Anxiety is going up, 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 up. And so that part of the brain, it's the amygdala, which deals with, it's a very old part of the brain. It's where our flight or fight response comes from, right? It is just on fire. It is activated when we're on social media, when we're on smartphones. And so mindfulness comes in. It not only turns down or deactivates that part of the brain, but it is reactivating or turning up our prefrontal cortex, which is things like emotion regulation, distress tolerance, working memory, all of these things that we want to work better. And so it really is the gold standard.
Wow. Yeah.
It's not talked about enough, or it's misunderstood, or
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it is. And I think that people don't appreciate it as much as they should. Taking time to, like, we rebranded it, I think, recently as like self-care, right? But I think that people sort of like lost the appreciation of doing things to get out of your own life or your own body or your own head and focus on like another thing for just a minute. Go outside and take a walk and enjoy the nature, or go to be in a group setting and interact with others where you're not thinking so much about like what's going on your calendar, what's going on your phone. And I feel like people really lost the appreciation for that. Only they would return to it, they could, manage their own like stress and anxiety.
And to your point, the other thing that's happened because of social media and smartphones is we're losing the ability to focus on something for a long period of time.
Yeah.
We just can't, right? We're always looking at the next thing.
Yeah.
And even if there was a study that was like, even if the phone was in the pocket, they were still not focusing on the task at hand. The phone had to be in an entirely different room for that focus to come back. And I think that's a reason why, and me and my colleagues see this, where we have more adults coming in that think they have ADHD. And when we go to assess for ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder, so it develops in childhood. And so when you start to ask these adults, okay, what was your childhood like? Did you struggle with any of these things? They didn't. And so they don't have ADHD. There's no adult onset ADHD. This is just where our brains have come to.
The attention span is so short. It's interesting too, because I think that what they refer to as the like TikTok algorithm or the Instagram like algorithm supports that lack of attention span, because the whole thing with, posting content is like the clickbait, like grabbing people's attention, right? Because like people are swiping until they find something they like to see, that they'll take a minute, like not a minute, like is even too much. Like you look at the analytics and like people are dropping off at like the 10-second time marker, right? And so it's interesting that these companies have created these algorithms, for lack of a better word, that encourage posters to and the consumers to have like an only attention span for like what really interests them. Like you have to work so hard to grab someone's attention for longer than 5-10 seconds.
Right. It's I even noticed that this morning. I mean, I'm, those who can't do teach, right? And I was on my phone, and the video was like way too long. And by way too long, I mean probably 30 seconds. And I was like, nope, swipe, too long.
No, too long. No, I mean, I do it every day. Like, I'm the biggest offender of that problem too. But it's like, it's so interesting because that's the whole premise of these social media platforms now, is grabbing users' attention where they won't give it to you,
Well, and I think the other thing that to your point about the TikTok algorithms or Instagram or any of them, it's made us lose our ability to think critically about stuff. Because one, we're only seeing things that are agreeing with our own perspective or what. I'm not even talking politically, I'm just talking in general. And we're not really thinking through things. Like we see, I don't know, I see all these parenting hacks, like say this, do this, don't do this, never say this to your child.
Yeah.
And it's like we're taking it as face value instead of saying, Let me think about who I am as a parent. Let me think about my child. Is this something that would work with them? Or what do I think? What do I believe? Let me think about other information that might contradict that. What do I think about the opposing side? We don't
Right.
do that.
Ignoring things you already know are not the
Right.
right. And I love that you bring that up, because that was one of like the biggest inspirations for sort of why we started this, was that we're seeing like on social media these like viral trends and hacks and like informational content they try to brand themselves as coming out, where it's like non-experts speak like they have no research background or nothing to prove what they're saying, but people are listening and they are not, as you said, not critically thinking and not thinking about anything that they already know. Like you see these like videos going viral of like a banana peel facial, like that's gonna clear all your or like, and the whole yeah, right, this is the whole reason like we wanted to start this, is like to debunk like myths like that. It's like people think that these things that are like completely not true are gonna work just because someone put up a video showing, look what I did and look what the results I came out with. Like behind the scenes, that person is applying like $500 skincare to their face every day,
Right.
like all kinds of laser treatments, and they're telling people, oh yeah, I just put a banana peel on my face and I look like, I don't
Right.
know, a Vogue model. Do you know? Like, it's so interesting.
Yeah, we've really entered this world where everyone is an expert.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it doesn't matter what training they have. Like everyone's an expert, and we see this a lot with. We actually we see it a lot as a team in terms of like diagnoses, right?
Okay.
Like I saw this on TikTok, and I think I have autism. I think I'm on the spectrum. And in terms of diagnoses, right? You could look at the diagnostic manual. If you look at it long enough, you're going to find something that applies to you with most every diagnosis.
Absolutely.
Right?
It's the WebMD of it all.
Yes.
It's the same thing.
Yeah. And so, being a trained clinician and saying to someone, let's really talk about what it means to make a diagnosis. Or like, to your point, let's talk about what skincare actually means.
Yeah.
Those kinds of, like, we don't just make a diagnosis by going down a list of criteria or just, feeling a few things. We look at, this all encompassing, number of symptoms that are impacting your life and how they're impacting your life. This is how we make a diagnosis. And people don't want to hear that. I mean, there's been times where I've taken out my diagnostic manual and I've said, let's go through the criteria. This is why I think you don't have this thing, which you think would be a good thing, right? Like, you don't have this. That's
and they're
good.
convinced that they do because they saw it in a video.
Right. And I don't know how we got here. And I've even seen it, where I think it can have some big health implications. Like I saw here that this person stopped their medicine, or they did this, or they added this supplement. Don't even get me started on supplements.
Right. Yeah. No, I think part of it, I try to come up with a reason for it in my head. And I think a lot of it just goes back to like people not wanting to leave their house, because to get a diagnosis from an expert, from from a practitioner, from someone who is well versed and can take out a manual and diagnose you.
Yeah.
That takes making an appointment. That takes going to the doctor. And like,
right.
I don't want to have to do that. Like, a couple weeks ago I had COVID and I did the same thing. I went on TikTok and first when I got it, I was like, who's getting COVID in summer of 2024? I was like, am I the only one? Like, come to find out later, like there's actually been a huge surge of it. But like my first instinct was like to search on TikTok, like COVID 2024, like seeing what's going on with people, what symptoms they're experiencing, and like what they're doing to manage those symptoms at home. Whereas my mom's like, message, just go to the doctor, like you live 5 minutes walking of Northwestern Clinic, like go book an appointment for yourself.
You have Dr. TikTok. You didn't need to go.
Right. Exactly. I didn't want to get up off the couch. So it's so interesting, like how it's shifting just based on that. And it's dangerous. People are like taking supplements at home. They don't even know what it's in it, what the ingredients are, what it's going to do to their body. My mom, she says her friends have even started doing it. Like you said, like it's affecting all age groups.
Yeah.
It's so interesting.
And from a therapy perspective, like to your point, yes, it takes time to come to therapy and you have to put in the effort, but I think the main reason people don't want to do it is we don't want to be uncomfortable, right? Like if someone tells me a reason why I feel this way, I can just find a fix and then I don't have to feel this way. But that's not how feelings work.
No.
Right? We have feelings. We have to experience the feeling. We have to sit with the feeling. And sometimes that in and of itself is enough to help us get out of it or feel better. But people don't want to do that.
No.
They want this quick, let me feel better. Let me work through it. No, I don't want to feel those emotions.
Yeah. It's that.
But you can't just eliminate half of our emotions.
Right. No, and it's so true. Like that instant gratification piece of it is so loud as well. It's like why they're not leaving their house to go do these things, go to therapy, go book an appointment, go to, go to the actual store versus getting home groceries delivered. It's like, I want it now. Like I want it and it has to come now.
Yes. And that's something that I really try to, like I said, my daughter's 6, that I really try to work with her on. Like if she's upset, my goal isn't always to make her feel better. My goal is to say, I'm going to sit with you while you have this feeling.
Yeah.
I'm not going to teach you that this is something we need to just get through or avoid or pretend doesn't exist, right? If you're sad, if you're angry, that's fine.
Yeah.
You can't hit me. You can't slam your door, which happened the other day, but you can be upset. That's okay.
Yeah.
What do we do now? And people really struggle with that.
Yeah.
All ages struggle. And when you see older people start to struggle with it, not older people, but like not young elementary kids, that's when you start to see all sorts of addictions and substance use disorders, because what's the quickest way to not feel something?
Wow, that's really interesting. I never thought about that. Is that something, along with the rest of like the mental health crisis, like the depression alongside of that, is it also, drug usage is also increasing?
Alcohol use, for sure, among adults is up, post-pandemic, and especially among women, we're seeing that trend too. It's up. Yeah, absolutely. Alcohol and drug use it's a big problem.
Wow.
And I don't want to say that like social media and smartphones caused it, but
right.
It's all kind of this big mess all together. And again, I don't know. I know how we got here, but I don't really know how we get out of it.
Yeah.
That's a much harder question to answer.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's hard because it's affecting people on such a wide scale. Of course, you're, working with your patients, but it's hard to know, like at a large scale level, what's the path forward.
Right, and I think one of your questions was like, do we start with the user? Do we start with who do we start with to start to change this? And of course, the simplest answer is to start with the creators, right? Like, let's change this. Let's not create that. But that's not going to happen, right? It makes money.
It makes so much money. It's so much money, right?
It's so profitable. And so from a business standpoint, I just don't think that's going to happen. From a government standpoint, will they change laws or regulations? Maybe. I think things that tend to be more in our control, one that's maybe a little under our control, is getting phones out of schools. Okay. Get them out of schools. And teaching people how to be responsible users. Again, I go back to my daughter because it's so fresh in my mind, but she doesn't have a phone. She doesn't have anything like that. But sometimes she likes to play with the camera on my phone. And we've talked about from an early age, like, you never take this in the bathroom. You never take a picture when someone is changing clothes. Like we've started to talk about all these different things, kind of like you start talking with kids about stranger danger, right? We've started talking about all these different things, and I think we have to do that from a young age. We have to talk about what it means and why it's not great and how we, again, use it responsibly.
Yeah, it's definitely important to teach from a young age for them to be responsible users and consumers, because like you said, it's such an alluring thing for younger people to start doing, because they're seeing how profitable it is. Like I'm hearing, big influencers, they're making like $70K a week. They charge companies some of them, they charge companies $250,000 to make one video sponsoring the product. And kids are seeing that and they're like, why should I go get a degree? Why don't I just start posting videos of my life?
Yeah.
It's so important when, there's such an alluring factor to it to teach them, okay, like, while you can go out and do that, like, be smart. Don't, responsibly make content. Like, don't harm others. Don't do this. Don't do that.
It breaks my heart when I hear a teenager or a pre-teenager sitting in my office, we're talking about their future goals, what they want to do for a job maybe one day, and they say, I want to be an influencer.
Yeah. No, but it's now a career. You hear young people, like, at our age, it's like, oh, I want to be a doctor. Oh, I want to be the president.
Yes.
Oh, this and that. No, it's I want to be an influencer, a content creator.
The first time I heard that, I didn't even know what to say. I don't even think I said anything.
Yeah.
I think I just said, okay. Like, I was so in shock. I was like, this is happening.
Yeah. It's a thing now. It's a thing now. And the question is, why? Like, of course there is, like, the money, like the money and, like, glamour and fame of it all, but it's also just from a deeper level. What do you think what is so valuable about that besides the money and the fame and the glamour?
I think it's this. It all started, in my opinion, with when Facebook, and so then you would get likes from people, right? And then you would get comments. And then, like, it just kind of spiraled from there. I have teens saying, I have to keep up my streak on Snapchat. I don't know what that means, but okay. So it all started with that. It's this constant reinforcement. People are saying, I like you, right? We want to be liked. That feels good.
Right.
But we actually feel lonelier because we're not interacting with people in real life. So it's all backwards.
Yeah, it is. It's so backwards. It's just crazy to me how much it's changed just from social media. And I think, like, one part where it starts to get dangerous is, like, okay, the like button, that's only good. That's only validation, right?
Right.
Then when you start getting to the comments, that's where things take a turn south, because you have this whole thing, and I'm sure in your practice and your profession, it's been talked about, especially with social media, of, like, this whole cancel culture effect. And the comment section, staying in the comment section, it's like influencers now have started, like, turning off their comment section because that's where things get negative, and that's where you can spend all your time wondering, like, reconsidering your whole thing. Like, okay, people are calling me this, people are calling me ugly, people are calling me stupid, people are this and that. And it's so sad, young people that are just so scared of the being canceled or being disliked, that's where it starts to get ugly.
If there was a book I wish everyone would read, it's Jonathan Haidt's Anxious Generation, and one of his first books, The Coddling of the American Mind. They are so good.
Okay.
And it talks about, when you said cancel culture, it made me think of it, because no one wants to think critically anymore. No one wants to think critically, like I said earlier, but no one wants to feel negative emotions, right?
Right.
And so certainly, like, if people are just flat out criticizing people, that's just mean. That's not great. But if someone brings an opposing viewpoint to the table, if it makes us feel uncomfortable, that doesn't mean the person shouldn't have brought it up. That doesn't mean they're wrong. Let me think about that. Okay, why did so-and-so say that? What is their point? What's their perspective? We don't do that. We're like, on to the next thing. Nope, I don't agree with you. Let's move on.
Right. And we don't realize that that's that person's opinion, and you don't know that person, and it's just one comment. Like, you see them, said influencer with 1 million positive comments, 1 million likes, and there's, like, the 5 comments that are negative and that make them reconsider everything. It's one person's opinion you don't even know. Like, you go look at their profile and, like, it's some, like, random person, like, sitting in their home just proliferating, like, negativity, like, everywhere. And it's just, like, it's so sad. And that's where I think, like, a lot of the the negative thoughts and like the depression and everything like that, where it's stemming from is the validation piece and like the comment section where things start to get ugly.
Yeah. Yeah. To your earlier point about counseling, I try and work a lot. I mean, I always have in all the years I've been doing this, but especially now with preteens and teens, more on confidence and self-esteem and how do we build that away from the phone, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I see these teens they're so inspiring. They're so good at all of these things. They're great athletes. They have this fantastic art ability. They are really good with words, right? They have all of these really awesome traits and they're not using them.
Yeah.
They're just online.
Yeah.
And so how do we cultivate these things? How do we show other people around you, your craft, your work, that sort of thing versus doing it online, right? How do we build this confidence in real time?
Wow. It's so true because I actually heard this statistic and it was on some podcast. I can't take credit for it. And I don't remember the exact number. So I'm like, rough, like balling it. But I heard that the average person checks their phone now 375 times a day. It's something crazy like that. Like
almost constantly.
Right. And it's scary. It is scary that like 375 times a day, someone is literally like picking up their phone, and it's not even that's the amount of times they're literally just looking at it. That's you opening it and possibly spending hours and hours and hours on it. So like every Sunday when I get those like iPhone metrics of like how long I've spent on my phone throughout the week, the numbers are so shocking.
Yeah.
So shocking.
Yeah.
And imagine like what better use we could make of that time.
Yes. So, and for the life of me, I can't remember the name of this book now. It was like a really popular book way back when, but it was about a dystopian society, and they wanted everyone to have the same intelligence.
Okay.
And so for people who are more intelligent, I think they put this thing in their ear and it would buzz.
Okay.
Every once in a while to interrupt their consciousness. So their level of intelligence would come down to the norm and everybody would be the same. That's what we're doing.
Yes.
You have a phone and it buzzes. You get a notification. We're kind of making ourselves dumber.
Yeah. No, not kind of. We are. Right. Exactly. And I think it's interesting. You brought it up earlier too, but I think it's fascinating because you were just talking about how the younger generations, they've become less independent, less like able to do things on their own. And I think it's funny because in terms of like the rivalry against the generations, people like to scapegoat COVID for that, right? They like to say, these kids, they went to college during COVID, they had virtual education, like that's why they're not as like smart or capable or this is not socialized as the rest of them. No.
Yeah. It's not.
No.
Look, the data absolutely supports what you just said. This all started before COVID.
Yeah.
All of it. Nothing was new. COVID maybe exacerbated a few of those things, but it wasn't new. It didn't create the problems. It just wasn't.
Yeah. It's just so interesting how like it all sort of like ties back together. It makes each other worse. Like yes, they like were at home during COVID, but yes, they also had their phones at home in COVID. Like, it just all flows into each other. One thing I wanted to ask you about that I'm just personally interested in, because I know you work with like not only children but adolescents and young adults, is how much do you see like patients coming in for help on like career transitions, life transitions, because you see people like graduating from high school, going to college, stepping out into the world. How much do you see that amongst your patients?
Not as much as I'd like to. I've seen. So when I see, I'm trying to put all my thoughts together. When I see teenagers, like high school students, they are way more focused on the pressures of high school. I have to get all these great grades. I have to do all of the things if I'm going to be successful. So they're too focused on that.
Yeah.
I start to see it after high school, whether they're going to college or not, of like, what do I want to do? I don't know. And then once they get into their like mid-20s, I definitely see people who are having more of I don't know what to do with my life. I don't know what I'm good at. which is really scary. It's like, how
Yeah.
do you know? Like, how do you not know? How did we get here? Where we have these, like, you're in your 20s, and it's like that's like the great years. These
Right.
are good years.
Yeah.
But you don't know what you're good at, which
Yeah.
is really sad to me.
Yeah.
And so, I've helped more people from a therapy perspective who are a little bit older, who are mid 20s, late 20s, trying to figure out what they want to do.
Mhm.
It hasn't happened as much with the younger generation, but I think we'll get there.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't think it'll happen with younger age until that, like, school pressure changes. Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, even from like I guess like not high school to college, but college to the real world, let's call it,
Uh-huh.
transition. I think it's fascinating because I thought a lot about this just in my own personal experience in college and not college, like pre-college life, you and then you're stepping out into the real world. It's like you're going from a very like close knit, closed environment where you're kind of like in a school with other people or you're at home you're amongst friends. Everything there's kind of like you're among familiar people that are kind of all doing the same thing, going to class,
Mhm.
this like your life, you're in the exact same phase of life as everyone else around you. But then
Mhm.
that like post college transition, I think is so formative for people, but it's more difficult than people tell you when you're young,
Yeah.
right? Like you step out into the real world and you're like, oh wow, I have waited all my life and have dreamed about being adult. I'm finally an adult, my own, like, running my own life, being independent, living in the real world. And it's hard. Like, I think it's crazy because you're going from an environment where you're like doing the same thing as everyone else around you to not. And it's, for me, like I found that to be very hard. Like I was like, wow, being an adult kind of sucks. Like you don't have time to like keep up with your friends. Like you're in different places or phases of life from your friends. It's hard, like as a young person, sort of like grinding in like your professional career in your 20s. It's hard to make time for other facets of your life. And
Yeah.
there's all the responsibility that comes with it and like the bills to pay and things like that. And not even that, but just sort of like having your life together, so to speak. So I think like that transition, I'm just curious to see like how other people and patients and like practitioners are like sort of handling how to support going through those transitions.
Yeah, and it's interesting too that you mentioned, like,
Yeah.
seeing it, like, thinking about it more in, like, your 20s, because, um, when we were talking, like, way earlier about, like, this adolescence is prolonging, right?
Mhm.
And Jean Twangy, I think I said her name right. I'm sorry if I didn't. She's this phenomenal researcher who she's kind of coined this term iGen. So adolescence is being prolonged. So whether people decide to go to college or not, they're not really capable of doing more adult things at the age where maybe we were 10, 15, 20 years ago. So you see a lot more people living with their parents. Again, a lot more people who don't have their license. And so it really isn't until like mid late 20s where they start to say, "Oh my gosh, now I have to do something,
Mhm.
but I don't know what, and now I feel behind or not." Like, and so there's all these, they just feel very kind of like dysthymic. Like,
Yeah.
I'm not sure what to
Yeah.
do.
Lost.
Yeah, and so in therapy, going back to helping them, like, let's start from the basics. Let's
Mhm.
start with confidence. Let's start with self-esteem. And then let's treat any sort of anxiety or depression or any other, symptoms that are kind of co-occurring right now. Let's do those things, and then we'll get into, what you wanna do with life,
Yeah,
because
who
I
you
don't.
are and like what you want to
Yeah,
do, what you like to do, what you think you're good at, what you
people don't.
see.
People think, like, what? Yeah, who are you?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Who are you? You're not you're not the person you see reflected back to you from social media. That's not you.
No.
Who are you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Not who do you put in front of the camera, but who truly are. Who
Yeah.
are you?
And I think people like make those realizations at different times in their life. Some people, they know it early on. They go, do exactly what they want to do, like get out of high school and they just know, like, they get on that path and ride it all the way to the end. I wasn't like that. Like, I thought I knew what I wanted to do. I rode the path, got, further down the path and was like, this isn't it. Like, this is not me. This is not what I like. And it's hard. Like, it's scary. There's so many emotions. There's anxiety, there's stress. It's like, putting behind like something you worked hard for, thought you were good at, and just switching over and starting over. It's definitely hard. So I'm just curious to see how others are navigating that. That's, I think, one of the biggest transitions in life, going from like your schooling years to whatever you're gonna do after, whether it's working, whether it's not.
You're right. To your point, it's a really tough transition that brings about a lot of anxiety, and a lot, I think, even more so now that, when we're talking about critical thinking skills earlier, I see a lot of young adults struggle to use those in terms of like putting it to their own life, right? Like, I'm really good at, or I really enjoy this thing, and how might that look in the real world? Like, kind of seeing it in 3 dimension, and they're struggling to do that. It's like, well, I saw this short clip on TikTok, and it said that, do this X Y Z, and then do this X Y Z, and so I'm just going to do that. But then that didn't work out, so now I feel depressed that it didn't work out, and now I'm sitting in front of you, and you tell me how to fix it.
Right.
Quickly.
It's like, what do I do? And that goes back to the whole critical thinking piece. It's like, well, what do you want to do? What do you think you should do?
Right. Like, what do you
told? Enjoy? Yeah.
Right. And people truly don't know what they just enjoy anymore, because if you're sitting and just scrolling and you don't know what you enjoy, right? Like, you're not getting out there and trying things like, okay, you tried basketball and you didn't like that. It didn't really, it wasn't your jam. That's cool. Yeah. So then you tried art, and you know what? You kind of like that. And then you tried this thing, and then you were cooking, and like, they're not doing that.
Right.
They're watching someone do it.
Yeah. But never themselves. Yeah.
Right. They're not using this whole body experience. It's just like the baby Einstein and the apple, right? Like, you're not going to learn you like an apple by watching a video of an apple.
Right.
You learn you like an apple by holding an apple, by smelling an apple, by eating the apple.
Eating the apple, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting. It's interesting how things are going, and like you, I'm very curious to see how we as a society manage it.
Yeah. Something needs to change, and I think something needs to change
definitely
pretty quickly. I think we're going to start to see some changes in the school. That's just my 2 cents. I think we're going to start to see things change there, because people aren't learning.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope
so too.
I hope we all start to get better.
No more phones.
I know. Well, Allison, it's been so fun talking to you today. Just, even personally, you answered so many of the questions that I've been curious to hear about. And is there anything else that you may have wanted to touch on or discuss that we didn't get to today? I definitely want to be respectful of your time, because I know we're a little over.
No, I mean, I could go on for hours.
Yeah, I know. I was just gonna say I could talk to you for hours. So I hope like, in the future we could have you back on, and you could, come on when our co-host is available as well.
Yeah. I guess the last thing I'd add is, I hope someday if people are listening to this, they listen to it, and then I hope they go out and they explore the world with all of their senses. That's what
I hope so. I hope that people listening to this, because our audience will, at least for the first period of time that we release this, will likely be that exact base of like young people that should be hearing this advice that you're giving. So I hope they take your advice and go live their lives and experience things for themselves.
Yeah.
And get that exposure and get off their phones for a minute.
Yes, I hope that too. Go have fun.
Yes.
Go have fun. Remember what it's like to have fun. Go do that. Go meet people. Go, interact.
Yeah.
Do all those things.
Go talk to others. Go just be with others, for sure.
Yes. Everyone wants to do it. They do. In some form or another.
Loves to do. Once you get into that setting, everyone loves to do it. I think for the most people, right? But
even if you're an introvert, like, okay, then go and sit in a bookstore and read amongst other people,
Yeah.
right? Like do something with around people in the real world.
Definitely. Well, Allison, thank you so much for talking to me today and spending your time. I really appreciated having you on, and this has been so fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been great.
Great. Thank you so much.